X4 weird.
This is the X4 and it is weird. This video is sponsored by Insta360. They've sent me the camera and paid for the production of the video. They've had no input on the script nor on my findings. These are all my own. I'll go into this camera's unique features as well as its inherent flaws and limitations. This is Insta360's 4th generation of their consumer 360 camera, and by the time we reach a 4th generation, usually all the major kinks have been ironed out. I've used the X1, which was fun, but you could see the housing it was in when you took it underwater. The X3 solved that problem with the incredible invisible dive case. This thing. Now, I can see what you're thinking. I can clearly see that thing. Well, yes, you can. But the camera can't. It's a really clever bit of kit. It's not only a housing, but it also serves as an extra lens. You see, water isn't just wet, it also magnifies a bit, so you need to compensate for that. This housing does that, and the camera then can give you an uninterrupted 360 view, even underwater. So they've cracked the 3-dimensional thing in their 3rd iteration. Have they cracked the 4th dimension with their 4th version? Well, yes. If you think about the 4th dimension being time, this version can now do slow motion. The previous version maxed out at 5.7K. This one can do 5.7K at 60 frames a second. So not only can you film everything around you, you can make it slow down too. And there's another flaw when it comes to this camera. Cameras, by their very nature, are considered what we call the 4th wall. It's a theatrical term, and I'll try and explain it using the box that the X4 comes in. So think of the box as a stage, and the stage has 3 walls, and where the audience sits is considered the 4th. In film and TV, the stage is the screen, and by consequence, the camera which records what we see on that screen. So if someone directly addresses the audience or the camera, that's called breaking the 4th wall. Doing so plays with an audience's sense of being part of the story. On one hand, it directly involves them into the story. On the other hand, by so blatantly exposing it to be a story, you can also take the audience out of that story. A 360 camera then inherently breaks that 4th wall, and that's what makes it weird. We are so used to how cameras work because until now they work pretty much in the same way that our eyes work, seeing only what's in front of us, creating that 4th wall within us. That makes it really hard for us to wrap our minds around what this camera sees, as it views the world more as a fish would see it. Two extremely wide angles facing in opposite direction but producing one image is a structurally bizarre proposition from a human perspective. Straight out of camera, you get 2 circular images, and that could be entirely too alien for us to deal with. So the cameras can already interpret those 2 images into one, and then clever software, either on your phone or on your computer, can stitch them together. This is where other weirdness pops up. The stitching isn't perfect. And the strange thing is, it hasn't improved much since the 1st iteration. This turns out to be much more tricky than you'd expect. It isn't just the stitching. Colors and shadows on the stitch lines are behaving strangely too. There's more noise and speckles and distortion there. And the weird thing there is that some of it seems to be brought on by the stitching, whereas you'd expect the software to be able to handle this, as it must be a fairly common thing. But it's almost like the software is making it worse. Part of the stitching problem must be the housing. It adds a layer of complexity that might be a bit too much for the software. And clever as it is, it also adds some other problems. It's made of plastic, so water is attracted to it and forms droplets on it as soon as you come above water. And water isn't the only thing attracted to it. It is also a dust and hair magnet, and any bit left on the housing will show up in your footage, like this hair of my dog Charlie. And it's an absolute magnet for scratches. Blink at it too hard and it'll scratch. Really, you have to be very careful with this housing. You can't just throw it in your dive bag. It needs a cover, and only remove the cover when you're ready to shoot. I took mine into a very narrow cave and really had to be more delicate than I normally am with gear. I took it to that cave to see how it would deal with a situation where you have a very dark environment and some really bright lights overhead, to see how the camera copes with that. It struggled. Most cameras would, but this is a fairly common situation in underwater filmmaking, where there's bright sun above you and deep dark waters below. And your average action camera deals better with it. The X4 overexposes the shadows, which leads to the highlights being completely blown out. You could partially compensate for this by underexposing about a third of a stop, maybe half a stop, but then the whole image gets darker. Another solution could be to shoot in HDR mode. You can with this camera, but I don't think you should. HDR means that it combines 2 or 3 exposures to create one image, which means that it needs to shoot double or triple the amount of information. That, in turn, means that it has less time to gather light, so the HDR mode is very dependent on bright conditions. I shot in fairly good conditions, but it still struggled and the results were a blurry mess due to the camera having to crank up its ISO in order to get all the exposures per shot. The result is a mildly less overblown image, which is much less clear. I don't think it's a good compromise. Another drawback of the camera's dynamic range is that the colors really struggle when you edit them. I tried both with the Insta360's surprisingly good software and with my own, but in both cases the footage started banding pretty badly very quickly. There's just not much room to edit in the image. It's already been processed to within an inch of its life, and any further tinkering breaks it. That's not only a software thing, it's also a hardware consequence. 5.7K might sound like a lot of pixels, but when you ask them to cover everything around you, they're spread too thin. Insta is of course aware of this, and this year they've introduced the 8K mode. In theory it's an improvement, and I think in really good conditions it works, but again, like in the HDR mode, it really needs a lot of light to work. I tried in decent conditions where it showed that same problem of overblown highlights and strange color fringing in the sky, and as soon as I took it down below 15 meters, it got too dark for the camera's liking, and some serious noise appeared in the shadows. Trying to fix that in post by crushing the shadows a bit made the whole image too dark. So the 8K doesn't work for underwater footage, except for the brightest conditions, like shallow stuff on a tropical beach. Same for the HDR. What also doesn't work is trying to make this camera behave like a normal camera, because it isn't. If you want this camera to work, you have to embrace its inherent weirdness, and then it starts shining. You can do things with this camera that no other setup can match. You can get shots that you've never seen before. Let it be its weird self, and you'll get some unique shots. It's made to do its own thing. They've tried to make it also do normal action camera stuff, but that's like making a beach ball into a Rubik's Cube. This thing wants to freak. It's also geared towards doing its own thing in edits. You can let AI figure out the highlights and pretty much make the video for you. That's very much not how I work, so screw that. Plus I reckon all those effects will look extremely dated in a few years, if not quicker. But if you let this camera do its thing, in 5.7K and with the H.265 compression, so the footage doesn't get too messy, and then you edit it in the excellent Insta360 software and export those clips, you can achieve truly visually arresting images. Now, would I buy this camera as my only action cam? No. It's too niche, it's too fragile, it's not made for it. But as a secondary camera for weird and unique shots, I don't think there's anything else on the market that comes close. Especially for underwater work, it is your only option if you want the invisible camera case. If you need something like that, it's a no-brainer. If you already have the X3, should you upgrade to the X4? No. Unless you really need the slow-mo, The image quality isn't noticeably better in the X4. The noise is similar, the battery is better, but overall, the X3 will probably serve you just as well. But if you don't have one of these yet, or you're still on the first or second generation, and you know you could use a few shots like this in your videos, then yes, go for the X4. Just know that you're getting something weird. Here's my question to you. Do you think it's possible to make a whole video, including narrative and everything, and shoot it only on the X4? Because I keep thinking about this camera as a secondary camera, you know, for the occasional weird shot. But that also makes it an interesting challenge, right? It's like, can I come up with a video and an idea where I only use the X4 and I use that weirdness to serve the story and tell a whole story? Or can I work within that limitation? And another question to you, would you like to see that? You know, if so, leave me a comment and say yes or something. Or are there any ideas that you would have and that you'd like to see shot on an X4? Or would you prefer to take this challenge yourself and shoot something solely on an X4 and maybe also only edit it in Insta360 software? It could be an interesting test and an interesting experiment. I'm pretty sure the results will get really weird.